right, so we have finally arrived at the end of our series on the fruit of the Spirit. Today, covering the last but first fruit of love. Now, intentionally, we've been working through each one in reverse order because I didn't want love to be the starting point as much as I wanted it to be the summation, right? This sort of crescendo where we reach the peak of this whole study. We have a lot to look at today, probably more than we have in prior weeks. In fact, by my word count, I can promise you it'll be more than we have in prior weeks. But don't worry, I'm still not a 2-hour sermon kind of guy. Today's teaching will be biblical, it will be theological, and it will, I hope and pray, largely be practical. So to begin, as we have every week in the past, we're going to start by reading the relevant portion of Galatians once again. So you can go ahead and turn there to Galatians 5. Hopefully at this point people have large portions of it, or even the whole thing memorized. It's Galatians 5, starting at verse 16. But I say, walk by the Ruach, and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. For the flesh sets its desire against the Ruach, but the Ruach sets its desire against the flesh. For these are in opposition to one another, so that you cannot do what you want. But if you are led by the Ruach, you are not under law. Now the deeds of the flesh are clear: sexual immorality, impurity, indecency, idolatry, witchcraft, hostility, strife, jealousy, rage, selfish ambition, dissension, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. I am warning you, just as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit God's kingdom. But the fruit of the Ruach is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Now here's where I give you the definition. As many of you probably already have heard, the word here is agape, right? Agape in Greek. This word carries much the same meaning as we would expect to find in English. Love, esteem, warm regard, affection, and so on. But we're going to build a better definition based on our study today that I will hopefully make clear what biblical love is really all about. Before we get into that, though, I'm first going to address something. I've got a couple little planned tangents today because I think this is a very impactful subject, and I think this is the perfect time to do it. So first, let me address something. It's a fairly common teaching. In fact, I first heard it taught from the pulpit of a non-denominational but mostly charismatic Baptist church that many of my friends attended when I was a kid. And that teaching was that there are 3 types of love in Greek. You've probably heard this before. There's 3 types of love. There is agape, right, the divine love, the selfless, sacrificial love. There is phileo, or the brotherly love amongst humans. And then there is eros, the erotic or sexual love. At least that's what the pastor of that church was saying. He then took us to John 21. So you can go ahead and go there, John 21:15, and we'll have a quick look. John 21, starting at verse 15. When they had finished breakfast, Yeshua said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said to him. You know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. Verse 16, he said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. He said to him, take care of my sheep. Verse 7 to him, he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him for a third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Yeshua said to him, feed my sheep. See, in the first 2 instances, Yeshua says, do you love me? These are both the Greek agapao, right? It's the form, it's the verb form of agape. Peter replies both times and says, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you, right? So Yeshua asks, do you divine love me? And Peter responds, I brotherly love you. All right, that's how the saying goes. The third time Yeshua says, Peter, do you brotherly love me? And Peter says once again, yes, I brotherly love you. But another way, it's as if Yeshua is asking, Peter, do you love me with divine love? And Peter responds, yes, Lord, I like you. The preacher said that this was 3 times because Yeshua knew that Peter would say phileo, not agapao, right? That he likes him, not that he divinely loves him. And yet these 3 times he gave Peter a chance before finally bringing it down a level. This shows that Yeshua's love was a sacrificial type, but Peter was only capable of giving the human brotherly love type. But see, this is actually a very common exegetical fallacy. First, agape can be, and in fact is, used in a variety of ways, as is phileo. The 2 words are largely synonymous, but they have to be examined in context to determine their usage. In John 3:35, we find, "The Father loves the Son and has given everything into his hand." Here, loves, right, again, is agape. But then in 5:20 of the same book, John 5:20, he says, "For the Father loves the Son and shows him everything he does. He will show him even greater works than these, so that you will be amazed." Here, love is phileo. So does the Father love the Son with divine love, but then later only like the Son? Obviously not. The usage is more wide-ranging than that. Second, the whole point of stating that there are 3 different distinct Greek words for love is largely irrelevant because the third, eros, is not found in the New Testament at all. So attempting to bring it into the picture here doesn't really help us. Lastly, verse 17 asserts that Yeshua asked the question 3 times, not 1 question twice and then lowering the standard for a second question. So what do we do? What do we do with this passage? For one, Yeshua has already demanded agape love of his disciples in chapters 13 to 15, as we'll see here in a little bit. So it cannot be that he simply concedes to Peter's inability. As John writes this, he uses both phileo and agape because he is setting up a set of parallels. He uses both words in a set of 3, but he also uses other sets of parallels. He says the first time, "Tend my lambs." Then the second time he says, "Shepherd my sheep." Different words. He repeats this the next time as well. Another parallel in the word "to know." "Yes, Lord, you know I do," is the same word the first 2 times, and then finally it's a different word. So the point here is that Yeshua's commissioning of Peter to tend the sheep, to shepherd them, his point here is not accepting the sort of love that Peter is capable of giving is merely just human brotherly love. Yeshua requires sacrificial love. The parallels in this passage are repeated each time through a set of 3. The reason, I believe, refers to Peter's own prior declaration that he loved Yeshua enough to die for him, and yet when the time came, he denied him 3 times. So here, Yeshua is repeating his instruction 3 times, and John writes this in such a way as to indicate the significance. 3 denials, 3 affirmations of love and loyalty. Here, Peter's restoration as a pastor, a shepherd, is affirmed. Then comes the prophecy immediately after these verses of how Peter would die. We can ask why this was appropriate at this very place, and I would posit the reason is related to what was said earlier in John's gospel. One, that the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, of which Peter has just been reminded that he is. This is from John 10:11. And then from John 15:13, it says, "Greater love," agape, "has no one than this, that he would lay down his life for his friends," which once again we will dig into here in a bit. So enough on that tangent, but I wanted to address it because the common interpretation, I believe, is lacking and is predicated on the idea that there are 2 distinctly different usages of these terms. I don't think that's the case. The reason John uses them is not because they mean different things, but he uses them in a specific literary way to highlight the whole point of this passage, which is that Peter is told to love him. Peter is expected to love with a, what we would say, divine love, a selfless love, a sacrificial love. Now, we just read through Galatians 5, so let's get back to Sha'ul. After all, we started by reading his letter, and we've read it multiple times over the last 8 weeks. In Galatians 5:22, Sha'ul lists first love in his list of the fruit of the Spirit. Now, I believe he does this first because, as we know from Scripture, that love is a prime principle, right? That is, love is the fulfillment of the law. Love of one's neighbor is supposed to take precedence. Romans 13:10, love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fullness of the Torah. In most Bibles, it'll say love is the fulfillment of the law. Matthew 22, 35 to 40 says, "And testing him, one of them, a lawyer, asked, 'Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the Torah?' And he said to him, 'You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The entire Torah and the prophets hang on these two commandments: love for God and love for man.'" That spans the entire universe. You see that? God and man, heaven and earth. Now, if you've studied through Galatians 5 before, or gone back and read through the whole chapter or book during this series, which is highly recommended, this should come as no surprise to you. Earlier in Galatians 5 at verse 6, Sha'ul says, "For in Messiah Yeshua, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any meaning, but only trust and faithfulness, expressing itself through love." And again, in Galatians 5, 13 to 14, "Brothers and sisters, you were called to freedom, only do not let your freedom become an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole Torah can be summed up in a single saying, love your neighbor as yourself." The second reason Paul lists love first, I believe, is because he continues to define it. I believe the fruits of the Spirit that he lists are things that follow after love. They're a part of description of what encompasses love. So we could read verses 22 to 23 this way: "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, which is expressed in joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. Against such things there is no law." See, I believe Paul writes it this way because he is intensifying, he is specifically pointing out love as the prime principle. There are multiple literary devices that authors use in Scripture to make their point. They don't have exclamation points at their disposal in the first century when he's writing or before. They don't have scare quotes to put on things. They can't bold or underline or italicize what they're writing in their manuscripts. They don't have ways of putting a little mark to indicate sarcasm. Since they didn't have punctuation marks at the time, they used certain methods and writing styles to accomplish this task. Now here's an example, and this is another planned tangent. A plangent. One example of such a writing style is a chiasm. Now, you've probably heard this before. I know Jeff and I have both mentioned this before. But this structure is called a chiastic structure, or a chiasm, where the author makes point A, then point B, then the central or focal point, and then B prime, which relates to B, and A prime, which relates to A. An example that we've looked at in this regard is Acts 2:42. So Acts 2:42 says, "They were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer." Literally, it's "and the prayers." So Acts 2:42 as a chiasm shows that they were devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, which relates to the point of to the prayers, right? This is a sort of formal, structured gatherings, right? Like we do here. We recite our liturgical prayers. We have a teaching. And then points B and B prime relate together. They were devoting themselves to fellowship and the breaking of bread. Fellowship is meeting together with other believers, and the breaking of bread, of course, refers to eating meals together. You can see in this structure here, as Luke writes, that he makes 4 points, right? But the whole central theme emphasizes togetherness. Now again, I realize this is off topic, but it never hurts to revisit that. And it's a great illustration of my point, namely that Luke was able to apply certain emphasis to his point by the way he structured what he wrote, even if he couldn't put exclamation points, parentheses, those sorts of things. Paul does the same thing, I think, with Galatians 5, not with a chiastic structure, with a sort of summation sort of style. He names love, and then he continues to build. He continues to build up to and expound on what all is encompassed in love. Now, in just a minute, we're going to turn to 1 Corinthians 13, which should be obvious on this topic, right? Hopefully everyone here has been expecting that. And we're going to read it. Before we do, a quick recap of chapter 12, though. Recall that when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians originally, there was no chapter break, so 12 flowed right into chapter 13. In chapter 12, Paul lays out some instruction for what the New American Standard Bible calls the use of spiritual gifts. He talks about how the body of Messiah is made up of many parts. 1 Corinthians 12:12-13. For just as the body is one and has many parts, and all the parts of the body, though many, are one body, so also is Messiah. For in one Spirit, in one Ruach, we were all immersed into one body, whether Jewish or Greek, slave or free, and all were made to drink of one Ruach. A little further down in the chapter, he says that God has appointed different gifts for the building up of the assembly. I do intend to, at some point in the future, teach about these. But I'm not covering all that here and now. So in verses 27-28 of the same chapter, Sha'ul says this. He gives us another list. He says, now you are the body of Messiah and members individually. Verse 28, God has put into his community first emissaries. Most of your Bibles will say apostles. First emissaries, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, healings, helps, leadership, various kinds of tongues. After listing the gifts and encouraging the Corinthians to earnestly desire the greater gifts, at the end of the chapter, he ends this section with a very final sentence of chapter 12 saying, and yet I show you a far better way. Now, what does this mean? If we just end the chapter there, if we just say, well, that's all he's got to say about this topic, it doesn't make sense. What is far better, especially after telling us to seek these gifts? Right? But that leads us directly to chapter 13. Verse 1, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Verse 2, if I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. Verse 3, if I give away all that I own, and if I hand over my body so I might boast, but have not love, I am nothing. See, Sha'ul isn't just emphasizing the supremacy of love. He is emphasizing it over and above even the gifts of the Spirit that he just mentioned. Verse 1, tongues. Right? If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, he's saying love is greater. The next part of the verse, prophecy and teaching and gifts of miracles. Right? If I have the gift of prophecy, if I have the knowledge and understanding of all mysteries, if I have the faith so as to remove mountains, but love is greater than all of these as well. And verse 3 seems to indicate, to me at least, the expectation of the abuse and eventually the martyrdom of the apostles for their witness. If I hand over my own body, but have not love, right? Even martyrdom without love, it is nothing. The point is that Sha'ul is clear. You can have these gifts, right? You can utilize them and still be lacking in love. He says this because it's a possibility. Verse 4 then, love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not brag, it is not puffed up, it does not behave inappropriately, it does not seek its own way, it is not provoked, it keeps no account of wrong, it does not rejoice over injustice, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, it endures all things. See, patience, kindness, love contains and embodies these things, right? So again, reverting back to the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5, these other things that follow after love are included in it, right? Love doesn't brag, right? These are the things that love doesn't do. It doesn't brag. It's not envious. It does not behave inappropriately. It is not self-seeking. Each of the things that it isn't are found among the works of the flesh in Galatians 5. Then we move on to verse 8. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will pass away. Where there are tongues, they will cease. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when that which is perfect has come, then that which is partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. But now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. This then leads us to a natural question, right? How do I know if I'm acting in love? You ever asked yourself that? How do I know if I'm acting in love? So here's a useful self-assessment. Take the works of the flesh from Galatians 5, the same ones we've been reading every week just before we get to the fruits of the Spirit. And then take the negatives from 1 Corinthians 13, as we just read: envy, bragging, inappropriate or disgraceful behavior. Make a list of them, right? And then ask yourself, am I doing X, Y, Z? So here's an example from 1 Corinthians 13. Am I pretending to be excited for my friend, but really I just want to get something out of our interaction because I'm acting out of envy, because she has something that I want? This would also pertain to selfish ambition. Or from Galatians 5, did I respond to him in a hostile way that created division between us? Right? Hostility, strife, factions, dissension. If you can tell that you're responding to and interacting with others in ways that match the works of the flesh, you are not doing it out of love. Now, that's not to say that you cannot get any sort of benefit in order for it to be love, right? This idea of altruism. I love my wife, and she reciprocates that, and I derive benefit from our relationship, but love is not negated simply because there is benefit. Now, on the other hand, if I only showed her love because she did things for me, then that wouldn't really be love, would it? See, a lot of people have issues in their relationships, especially in marriages, because their conception of love, what it is, what it isn't, and how it looks, is off. When you decide to show love to someone, you make a conscious effort. It doesn't just happen. Sometimes this is harder than others. We all have friends and family members that are harder to love than others, you know? Surely you can all think of someone. But this is something that we set our hearts and minds to do, and it is something that we are required to do. Now, I've encountered the doctrine quite a bit of what I call Torah Supremacy, right? This idea that all the commandments are in the Torah, and anything that's not found in Genesis to Deuteronomy, it might be good advice, but it's not really required of us. But see, I find that problematic. God spoke to Moses. God also spoke to Isaiah. He also spoke to King David. He also spoke directly to people who wrote his biographies in the Gospels and Acts. And he spoke to the apostles. God's word through Isaiah is no less scripture than his word through Moses. Torah tells us to love our neighbor, but that doesn't tell us who our neighbor is. Yeshua, however, did. The parable of the Good Samaritan that we read a few weeks back shows that. I won't reiterate it, but you can go back and watch that one. When it comes to love in marriage, you have to choose it. You have to decide to love your spouse. And sometimes that means doing the things you don't want to do. But the excuse of, well, that's just not who I am, doesn't fly when it comes to love. Are you patient with your spouse? Because love is. Are you kind to them? Because love is. Are you envious? Do you brag or gloat? Right? Are you putting them down? Are you behaving arrogantly towards them? Because love doesn't. Now here's a big one, especially in a lot of relationships. Are you keeping an account of wrongdoing? Right? This is huge. Bringing up the past as a means of manipulating or withholding something. Love doesn't. And it's interesting that Paul includes that as a specific action of what love does not do. It does not keep an accounting of wrongdoing. Love is not selfish. It does not require for you to do X, Y, Z for me, or else I won't love you. Let me reiterate, we don't have that luxury. Now, a great marital resource in this regard is the 5 love languages. Probably everybody's heard of that before. The book details 5 primary categories through which people give and receive love. If you're not familiar with them, here's a refresher. Acts of service, receiving gifts, quality time, words of affirmation, physical touch. It's worth noting that the language you speak and the language that your spouse speaks have a good chance of not being the same. All right, it's also often the case where the language in which you receive love is not the same as the language in which you demonstrate it. For example, I might receive love by Elizabeth speaking words of affirmation to me, but my natural response when I want to show her love in return is acts of service, not words of affirmation. Right? These are the sorts of conversations that every couple should be having. And let me tell you a truth that some people find uncomfortable. Your spouse's love language is not for you to decide, it is for you to speak. It isn't your responsibility to buy your wife really expensive fancy jewelry for her birthday. But if she receives love by receiving gifts, then it absolutely is your responsibility to generously give to her. Maybe it's something small and inexpensive. Maybe it's something that you made on your own. Maybe it's something expensive that she's had on her Amazon wish list for a while. Maybe it has scales and gets fed a mouse every week. See, I dropped that in here because my wife and I joke that her love language is reptiles. The point is, you don't get to decide how your spouse receives love, just like you don't get to decide what emotions they're allowed to feel. Trying to dictate the means by which your spouse may be allowed to receive love is self-serving, right? And love is not. Now, maybe you're a woman of few words. Maybe you're really quiet, you don't talk much, and maybe your husband's love language is words of affirmation. Maybe you struggle with finding the words to speak, but you're really good at acts of service. So when you want to show that you love him, you take a little bit of extra time and do some of his chores on the to-do list. This is the sort of default for most couples. Most people this is what I think love is, so I do it for you. But that's often not the case. And many times people need a wake-up call to understand that they have a responsibility to speak the language of their spouse. See, love is about selflessness. It's not just this affectionate, fleeting emotion that we feel, that we so often call love, the butterflies in your stomach and that sort of thing. Love is a choice. Love is an action. It's something that is active. We have to do love. Love is, by its very definition, selfless. You can go ahead and turn to 1 John chapter 4. We'll start with verse 15. See, John has a lot to say about love in his gospel as well as in his epistle, at least the first one. 1 John 4:15. If anyone acknowledges that Yeshua is Ben Elohim, that is the Son of God, then God abides in him, and he abides in God. So we have come to know and trust in the love that God has for us. God is love. Now, whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. In this way, love is made perfect among us, so that we should have boldness on the day of judgment. For just as he is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and the one who fears has not been made perfect in love. Verse 19, we love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. Verse 21, and this commandment we have from him, that the one who loves God should also love his brother. Halfway through verse 16, John hits us with a very important and impactful truth bomb. God is love. 3 simple words. God is love. We love because he loved us. If you can't love your brother, you can't love God. Aside from here in his epistles, John has a lot more to say about love. And this time he records it as a teaching straight from the mouth of the Messiah himself. So now we go to John's Gospel, chapter 13. We'll start at verse 31. This is the Last Supper scene, right? Yeshua had just finished washing the feet of the disciples, and he predicted his own betrayal. And verse 31, as we begin reading, is right after Judas gets up and he leaves. Verse 31, then when Judas had gone out, Yeshua said, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will search for me, and just as I told the Judean leaders, so I say to you now, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, so you must also love one another. By this I will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Now, this has stumped people for quite some time, especially in the Torah movement, for 2 reasons. How, or why, would Yeshua say that he issued a new commandment? And number 2 is, what makes this new? To the first question, some have argued that Yeshua can't add commandments, as that would necessitate changing the law. But I find that largely irrelevant, since Yeshua himself gave the law in the first place. They're already his commandments. The second question, I think, is a much better one. How is this new? Right? We know, as we've already read from Matthew 22, as a quote from Leviticus, that we are supposed to love our neighbor. So loving each other should be a given. I believe, and this is my view, that this is not a declaration of a wholly new requirement. That is, Yeshua is not in fact issuing a never-before-heard commandment to love each other. Rather, he is exemplifying for them the substance and type of love required that they had never before known. See, they were already arguing about who was their neighbor. Love your neighbor. Well, who's my neighbor? Well, but what is love, right? Begin to break down piece by piece what the Torah actually says to see whether or not, well, there's a loophole here. Well, he's not my neighbor, right? and we still do that today. But that wasn't the example that he was setting, and that's not his commandment of love that he was issuing. He washed their feet, a symbolic act of selflessness. He predicted his own betrayal, and here he is merely hours away from an unfair arrest, an unjust trial, and an undeserving crucifixion. And this is the type of love that he is requiring, the sort that would die for others. I mentioned this earlier, but it brings us to John 15, 12 to 13. Still part of this same discourse, right? He starts teaching them right after what we call the Last Supper. And the teaching continues on to the next couple chapters in John. So this is still part of that same teaching. John 15, verse 12. This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. Here's the expanded definition of love that Yeshua is using, the one that he now requires as an obligation, as a mitzvah or a commandment. Right, John 15, 17. These things I command you so that you may love one another. In the Messianic movement, we love to argue. I just stop there. We just love to argue. But we especially love to argue about commandment keeping, about how to walk out each of the commands of the Torah. But how about a little more focus on how to walk in love towards each other? Which brings me to my next major point, love in the commandments. Either we talk about love as a replacement of commandment keeping, right? And I've heard that in sermons from the pulpit before, that love has replaced the law. All the law is summed up in love, so as long as you love people, you don't have to worry about these other things. So either we talk about love as a replacement of commandment keeping, or we strip out all the things beyond love and just keep commandment keeping. And that's what gets to mechanical religion. That's what gets to legalism. But instead of inclining towards either extreme, how about we take a look at love as expressed in the commandments? While we're on the topic, some of y'all may be familiar with this, but I assume most people are not. In the Shacharit, which is the morning prayer service in the synagogue, there is a prayer that is recited before the Shema. There's actually two of them that are greatly related, and it's debated whether it should be part of the morning or part of the evening service, and if you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi, they do it differently or whatever. I'm not going to get into all that. The prayer in one group is called Ahavat Olam, which means everlasting love. In the other group, they call it Ahava Rabbah, which means great love. So I'm going to read you an English translation of Ahava Rabbah, or a great love. The main difference between them, like I said, is whether it's Sephardi or Ashkenazi, but that's not a big deal here. But again, this is a prayer that normally in the synagogue service, on a regular old weekday morning, you would recite before the Shema. Everybody knows the Shema. We recite it every week. This is what you would say beforehand. With a great love you have loved us, Adonai our God. You have given us an abundant and exceeding measure of compassion. Our Father, our King, for the sake of your great name, and for the sake of our ancestors who trusted in you, whom you taught life-giving statutes by which to fulfill your will wholeheartedly, be gracious to us and instruct us. Our Father, merciful Father, who shows mercy, have mercy on us and grant our hearts understanding so that we may comprehend and see, listen and learn, teach and observe, perform and maintain all the words of the teachings of your Torah in love. Enlighten our eyes with your Torah, cause our hearts to cling to your commands, and unify our hearts to love and fear your name. And may we never be shamed or disgraced or falter. For we have placed our trust in your holy, great, and awesome name. May we celebrate and rejoice in your salvation. May your mercy, O Adonai our God, and your abundant kindness never leave us. Hasten and quickly bring us blessing and peace. Bring us in peace from the four corners of the world. Break off the yoke of the nations from our necks, and quickly lead us upright to our land. For you are God who brings about salvation, and you have chosen us from all peoples and tongues. And you, our King, have lovingly brought us close to your great name, so that we may thankfully acknowledge you, proclaim your oneness, and love your name. Blessed are you, Adonai, who chooses his people Israel with love. See, that's pretty strong, isn't it? This is a prayer that asserts that God has everlasting love. He has great love, and that we want and strive to be obedient to all that he requires. This prayer asks that he would grant us what is necessary to do so. It praises him for his working of salvation. Right? I'm going to read this line again. Our Father, merciful Father, who shows mercy, have mercy on us and grant our hearts understanding so that we may comprehend and see, listen and learn, teach and observe, perform and maintain all the words of the teachings of your Torah in love. That last part is very important, specific caveat. Not just that we do them, but that we do them in love. These two topics are not mutually exclusive. A love for the commandments and a love that is lived out towards God and man go hand in hand. In fact, the answer of how do I love God as well as how do I love man is most often contained in the Torah. Here's a prime example. Exodus 20, 1 through 7. I'll say Exodus 20, and a lot of people are going to recognize this. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am Adonai your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. Do not make for yourself a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or on earth below, or in the water under the earth. Do not bow down to them. Do not let anyone make you serve them. For I, Adonai your God, am a jealous God, bringing the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to the thousands of generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Verse 7, you must not take the name of Adonai your God in vain, for Adonai will not hold him guiltless that takes his name in vain. Verse 8, remember the Sabbath day, Yom Shabbat, so keep it holy. You are to work 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Shabbat to Adonai your God. In it you shall not do any work, not you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your cattle, nor the outsider that is within your gates. For in 6 days Adonai made the heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Thus Adonai blessed Yom Shabbat, the Sabbath day, and made it holy. Verse 12, honor your father and your mother so that your days may be long upon the land which Adonai your God is giving you. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor. Do not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, his manservant, his maidservant, his ox, his donkey, or anything that is his. These are the 10 commandments, right? The 10 words. If you love Adonai, you won't have other gods. You won't bear his name in vain. You won't make and worship idols. You will keep the Shabbat. If you love your fellow man and woman, you won't bear false witness against them. You won't commit adultery with and against them. You won't murder them. You will honor your parents. The two go hand in hand. The Torah guides us in what loving others looks like when it's lived out. But more than just a list of do's and don'ts. Once again, love is active and intentional from the heart, being concerned with others. It is lived out not simply passively, but with intention towards one another. It is lived out the same way as faith. And we can take this parallel from James 2:14. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can such a faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but you do not give them what the body needs, what good is that? So also faith, if it does not have works, is dead by itself. Back to 1 John, this time chapter 3. Verse 23, now this is his commandment. Once again, this is not a suggestion. This is a commandment. This is a requirement. That we should believe in the name of his Son, Yeshua the Messiah, and love one another just as he commanded us. Faith and love together. Not separately, together. You notice the word commandment is singular. That is, there's not a command to believe and then a separate command to love. They go together. When we, the body of Messiah, love others, we make Messiah visible. Let me say that again. When we love each other, we make Messiah visible. I don't just mean that we imitate Yeshua by loving, which is certainly part of it. I mean something beyond that. John says in his gospel, in John 1:18, that no one has seen God at any time. Then he repeats this phrase in his first epistle, 1 John 4:12. No one has ever seen God. Okay, he's told us that before. But then he says, if we love one another, God abides in us, and his love in us is made perfect. When we emulate Yeshua, specifically by our love for others, we make God visible, as God is love, once again. As we close up for the day, I have just a couple more points, and then the final couple questions for reflection. Now, we may well ask, what does love look like? Right? We asked that question earlier. You can start by examining your own heart, your own actions. If you are knowingly being selfish in your interactions with others, once again, that's not love. If you are engaging in the deeds of the flesh, it's not love. Now, undoubtedly, someone will ask about boundaries. Does this loving others mean that we become doormats for them? Does it mean we can never tell people no? Certainly not, right? But it does mean that we have to take the high road. It does mean that we need to turn the other cheek. We need to not return an insult when we feel insulted. It means we need to put others before ourselves. Currently I'm taking a class for my degree in Greek exegesis of the book of Philippians, right? And part of the course requires us to translate over the course period the entire letter. We recently got about halfway through chapter 2, and something really stuck out to me. Right, Philippians 2, verse 3, this is the Tree of Life version. It says, "Do nothing out of selfishness or conceit, but with humility consider others as more important than yourselves." Now from the New Revised Standard, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves." And lastly from the NIV, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility value others above yourselves." So which is it? Do we just treat people better than the way they treat us? Do we just value them more? It's a little bit more extreme than that. In Greek, the way this is written, it uses the word hupercho, right, meaning better than or superior to. Not just thinking of others first, not just putting people first, but actually considering them as superior to yourself. Now that is truly humbling. That is really humility, regarding others as better or superior to us. Love, as the Scriptures show, should be expressed in selfless terms and at times in sacrificial terms. Love means putting others first. Loving them puts them first. Loving God, as expressed in His commandments, often means putting aside the self, right? The desires of the things that we want to do, but we put Him first. And we do that by being obedient children to His commandments. Once again, these two ideas are not contrary, but they work together. So remember, you can have the gifts of the Spirit and not be loving to others. And if so, your gifts are useless. You can keep the commandments, but not be loving to others. And if so, your works are doing no kingdom building. Loving God and loving others, not because it's the best way, not because it's the way that we simply should do it, but because it's the only way that the kingdom works. So here's the final few questions of the day and of this series as we wrap up. The first one is, what stories from Scripture, aside from Yeshua's crucifixion, I feel like that one's blatantly obvious, demonstrate the theme of love? Right? Spend the next few days thinking, what from Scripture can you show definitively that demonstrates the theme of love? Number 2, what examples can you recall from your own life, specifically in your own cultural context, your own hometown, maybe the place where you live now, that illustrate the power of love to prove the truth of the gospel? Right? And the third and final one, what evidences can you think of that prove the presence, or at times the absence, of love as a fruit of the Spirit? How have you seen this walked out? How have you seen people living this? And if you want a really good exercise, think of in your own life and in your own self the ways that you haven't.